December 1944. While American families decorated their Christmas trees and wrapped presents on the other side of the Atlantic, thousands of young American soldiers were spending what would be the strangest and darkest Christmas of their lives. But in a prisoner of war camp in the heart of occupied Germany, something impossible was about to happen. Armed guards and enemy prisoners, separated by barbed wire and the hatred of a brutal war, were about to share a moment that would defy everything war represented. They would sing together, the same song, in the same words. And for a few minutes, World War II would simply cease to exist in that frozen piece of land. This is the story nobody told you about Christmas 1944, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why this moment was erased from history books. Europe was bleeding. 6 years of war had turned entire cities to ash, and millions of men, women and children were already dead. The Allies were pushing through the West, crushing German forces retreating in desperation. Every inch of territory gained cost blood, and the hatred between both sides had reached its peak. For American soldiers, Germans weren't just enemies. They were Nazis, the architects of unimaginable evil. For German soldiers, Americans were the invaders destroying their homeland. Trust was impossible. Mercy was rare. And kindness, in that winter of 1944, seemed like a forgotten word from another lifetime. The world had become a machine of death, and every man wore the uniform of that machine. But Christmas has always had a strange power. Even in the darkest moments of human history, December 25th carries something that refuses to die. A memory of peace, a whisper of home, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, humanity still exists somewhere beneath the uniforms and the orders. For American soldiers stationed as guards in German POW camps, Christmas 1944 was supposed to be just another day of duty. Watch the prisoners. Keep them in line. Make sure nobody escapes. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment, but nobody expected warmth. Nobody expected connection. And certainly, nobody expected what was about to unfold in one particular camp, where the snow fell heavy and the cold cut through every layer of clothing like invisible knives. The prisoners inside the camp were German soldiers, men who weeks earlier had been firing at Americans across fields and forests. Now they sat behind wire fences, defeated, exhausted, wondering if they would ever see their families again. Some were hardened veterans who had fought since Poland in 1939. Others were barely 18, boys forced into uniforms and thrown into a war they never understood. They were cold, they were hungry, and they were terrified of what Christmas would mean this year. The first Christmas away from home, the first Christmas as prisoners, possibly their last Christmas alive. The American guards were not much different. Most of them were young men from small towns across the United States, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, students from California who had put their lives on hold to fight a war in a continent most had never seen before. They had been trained to see Germans as monsters, but standing guard over these shivering, broken men in the snow, the lines started to blur. These weren't the SS troops who ran concentration camps. These were just soldiers, tired, scared, human. And yet the orders were clear: maintain distance, maintain discipline, maintain the wall between captor and captive. But then came Christmas Eve. The snow fell heavier, the temperature dropped, and somewhere in that frozen camp someone started to hum a melody that both sides knew, a melody that had been sung in German churches and American living rooms for over 100 years. A melody that belonged to no army, no nation, no flag. Silent Night, Stille Nacht. And what happened next would become one of the most beautiful and most forbidden moments of World War II. The melody came from inside the barracks, soft at first, almost invisible beneath the howling wind. One of the German prisoners, a man whose name history would never record, began to sing, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. His voice cracked with cold and exhaustion, but the words carried across the frozen camp like a ghost from another world. Other prisoners, huddled together for warmth, began to join. Their voices rose together, building a fragile harmony that seemed impossibly out of place in a prison camp surrounded by machine gun towers and barbed wire. They sang in German, the language of the enemy, the language Americans had been trained to associate with orders barked by Nazi officers and propaganda broadcasts. But this was different. This was a prayer. The American guards heard it. At first they tensed. Singing could mean trouble. It could mean coordination for an escape attempt. It could mean defiance. But as the melody became clearer, recognition hit them like a punch to the chest. They knew this song. Every single one of them knew this song. It was Silent Night, the same carol their mothers had sung to them as children, the same hymn that played in every church back home, the same melody that just 1 year ago had filled their living rooms while families gathered around Christmas trees and pretended the war was far away. And now, here it was, being sung by the men they were supposed to hate. One guard, a young corporal from Pennsylvania, stood frozen at his post. His rifle felt heavier than it ever had. He thought about his own family, probably gathered around the radio right now, listening to Bing Crosby, eating his mother's cookies, wondering if he was safe. He thought about the letter he had written home 3 days ago, lying about how he was fine, how the war would be over soon, how he would be home for next Christmas. He thought about the German boy in the barracks, maybe 19 years old, who had cried himself to sleep the night before. And then, without thinking, without permission, without any regard for protocol or military discipline, the corporal began to sing. Silent Night, Holy Night, in English. His voice joined the German voices, weaving into the same melody, the same rhythm, the same desperate hope. Other guards turned to look at him, some with shock, some with anger. But then another guard joined, and another. Within minutes, American voices and German voices were singing together, separated by wire and war, but united by a song that predated all the hatred. The camp commander, a captain from Ohio, heard the singing from his quarters and rushed outside, ready to shut it down, ready to restore order. But when he reached the fence and saw his men standing side by side with tears freezing on their faces, singing with the prisoners they were supposed to guard, he stopped. He stood there in the snow, listening, and he did nothing. For 8 minutes, the war stopped. Not officially, not on any map or in any report. But in that camp, in that moment, the war simply ceased to exist. There were no Americans, no Germans, no guards, no prisoners. Just men cold and far from home, singing the same prayer their grandmothers had taught them. All is calm, all is bright. The words echoed across the frozen ground, and for those 8 minutes they were true. When the song ended, silence fell heavier than the snow. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. And then slowly the guards returned to their posts. The prisoners returned to their bunks, and the war continued. The next morning, December 25th, 1944, the camp woke to an uneasy silence. The magic of the night before had evaporated with the darkness, replaced by the cold reality of war. Orders still needed to be followed. Prisoners still needed to be counted. The machine of war had no pause button, no matter what had happened under the stars. But something had shifted. The guards who had sung the night before avoided eye contact with each other, as if acknowledging what they had done would make it real, would make it punishable. They had fraternized with the enemy. They had shown weakness. They had, for 8 minutes, forgotten they were soldiers. And in the United States Army of 1944, that was unacceptable. The camp commander faced an impossible decision. Technically, what had occurred was a breach of military discipline. The Geneva Conventions allowed humane treatment of prisoners, but they did not allow friendship. They did not allow shared moments of vulnerability. The line between captor and captive was supposed to remain absolute, because the moment that line blurred, the entire structure of military order began to crumble. If guards started seeing prisoners as human beings with families and fears and memories of Christmas, how could they be expected to shoot if those prisoners tried to escape? How could they maintain the psychological distance necessary to do their jobs? The commander knew he should file a report. He knew he should discipline the men involved, but he also knew that if he did, he would be punishing soldiers for being human. And that felt like a crime worse than any breach of protocol. So he made a choice that would never appear in any official record. He buried it. He wrote nothing in his reports about the singing. He mentioned nothing to his superiors. He simply called his men together on Christmas morning and told them that what happened the night before would stay in that camp. No letters home about it. No stories shared with other units. It was a moment that existed outside of time, outside of war, and it needed to remain that way. The men understood. They nodded in silence, and they kept the secret. Inside the prisoner barracks, the German soldiers faced their own reckoning. Some felt shame for having sung with the enemy, as if they had betrayed their country by sharing a moment of peace with the Americans. Others felt something they had not felt in years, a flicker of hope that maybe the world was not entirely lost, that maybe beneath all the uniforms and flags and orders, humanity still existed. One older prisoner, a veteran who had fought in the First World War and now found himself fighting in the Second, sat on his bunk and wept quietly. He had sung Stille Nacht with his daughter before the war. Now he had sung it with the men holding him prisoner. He did not know if that made him a traitor or simply a father who missed his child. Perhaps it was both. The day passed like any other. Roll call, rations distributed, guards patrolling, prisoners sitting in cold barracks waiting for a war to end. But everyone in that camp carried the memory of the night before like a secret wound, beautiful and painful at the same time. They had touched something forbidden. They had glimpsed a world where enemies could share a song, and now they had to pretend it never happened because the war demanded it, because survival demanded it, because admitting it had happened would mean admitting that everything they had been taught about the enemy was wrong. The war did not care about moments of peace. Within weeks, the camp began to empty. Prisoners were transferred to larger facilities. Guards were reassigned to new posts. The men who had sung together on Christmas Eve scattered across Europe, carried by the relentless machinery of war to different battlefields, different camps, different fates. Some would survive the war, others would not. But all of them carried the memory of that night, locked away in a place they could not speak about, could not share, could not even fully understand. It became a ghost story they told themselves in the quiet moments before sleep, wondering if it had really happened or if the cold and exhaustion had created a shared hallucination. For the American guards who returned home after the war ended in 1945, the silence continued. They came back to parades and celebrations, to a country that wanted to hear stories of heroism and victory, not stories of singing with the enemy. The narrative of World War II was already being written, and it had no room for moral complexity. It was a story of good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny, heroes versus monsters. There was no space in that story for a moment, when the monsters turned out to be young men who sang the same Christmas carols. So the veterans kept quiet. They hugged their families. They tried to forget the cold, and they buried the memory of Stille Nacht beneath decades of silence. The German prisoners who survived faced an even harder silence. Post-war Germany was a country trying to rebuild itself from total destruction, a nation grappling with the horrific revelations of the Holocaust and the shame of having followed Hitler into catastrophe. Nobody wanted to hear stories from former soldiers. Nobody wanted to remember the war at all. The collective guilt was too heavy, so the German men who had sung Silent Night in a prison camp stayed silent as well. Some told their children years later, in whispered conversations, but most took the story to their graves. It was too fragile, too strange, too impossible to explain to a world that wanted clear lines between victims and perpetrators. And so the story disappeared. No official reports documented it, no photographs captured it, no journalists wrote about it. It became one of thousands of small forgotten moments that happened during the war, moments that did not fit the grand narrative, moments that revealed the uncomfortable truth that war is fought by human beings who sometimes, despite everything, remember they are human. Historians writing about World War II focused on the big battles, the strategic decisions, the political consequences. They had no time for a single night in a single camp where nothing strategically important happened. And yet for the men who were there, it was the most important night of the war. Decades passed. The Cold War came and went. The generation that fought World War II began to die, and with them, the memory of that Christmas Eve began to fade into complete obscurity. By the time the 21st century arrived, it seemed the story would be lost forever, just another piece of history that slipped through the cracks, erased not by malice, but by simple indifference. But stories have a way of surviving. Sometimes they hide in old letters discovered in attics. Sometimes they emerge in interviews with veterans conducted just before they pass away. And sometimes They wait for someone to go looking for the truth hidden beneath the official version of history. In 2003, a historian researching American POW camps in Germany stumbled across something unusual. Buried in the personal papers of a deceased veteran from Pennsylvania, there was a journal entry dated December 24th, 1944. The entry was brief, almost cryptic. It described a cold night, a German song, and a moment the veteran called the strangest thing he had ever experienced. The historian initially dismissed it as a personal anecdote, perhaps exaggerated by memory or trauma. But something about the entry nagged at him. He began searching for corroborating evidence. He contacted veteran organizations. He posted inquiries in military history forums. And slowly, impossibly, other voices began to emerge from the silence. An 86-year-old veteran in Ohio responded to one of the inquiries. He had been there. He remembered the singing. He had never told anyone because he thought nobody would believe him, or worse, that they would think he had been weak, sympathetic to the enemy. But now, near the end of his life, he wanted the story recorded. He wanted someone to know that it had happened. The historian interviewed him for 3 hours, and the old man cried through most of it, not from sadness but from relief. For nearly 60 years, he had carried the memory alone, wondering if it had been real. Now, finally, someone was listening. More veterans came forward. A man in California, another in Texas, a woman whose father had served as a guard and had told her the story on his deathbed, making her promise to never forget it. Each testimony added details, small pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across decades and continents. They remembered the snow. They remembered the cold. They remembered the first voice starting the song and the shock of recognition when they realized what was being sung. Some remembered crying. Others remembered feeling terrified that they would be punished. But all of them remembered the 8 minutes when the war stopped. The historian tried to find German survivors, but that proved almost impossible. Most of the prisoners had returned to a Germany that did not want to hear from them. Many had died in the chaos of the immediate post-war years. Others had changed their names, erased their pasts, disappeared into new lives where nobody knew they had been soldiers. But eventually, through archives in Berlin and Stuttgart, the historian found 2 former prisoners who had been in that camp. One was 91 years old, living in a nursing home in Bavaria. When asked about Christmas 1944, the old man closed his eyes and began to sing, Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. His voice was weak and broken, but the melody was perfect. He remembered every word. He remembered the American voices joining in. And he remembered thinking in that moment that maybe God had not abandoned them after all. The evidence was undeniable. It had happened. On Christmas Eve 1944, in a frozen prisoner of war camp somewhere in Germany, American guards and German prisoners had sung Silent Night together. It was not a grand moment of diplomacy. No officers orchestrated it. No politicians claimed credit. It was simply a moment when music proved stronger than war, when a 200-year-old carol reminded men on both sides that they were still human. And it had been hidden for almost 60 years, not because it was shameful, but because it did not fit the story anyone wanted to tell about World War II. Understanding why this story was buried requires understanding how we remember war. Every nation that fights a war needs a narrative, a clear story that justifies the sacrifice, honors the dead, and makes sense of the chaos. For the United States, World War II became the good war, the righteous war, the war where American heroes saved the world from absolute evil. And that narrative was not wrong. The Nazi regime was evil. The Holocaust was real. The fight against fascism was necessary. But the problem with narratives is that they require simplification. They require clear heroes and clear villains. They cannot handle moments where the villains turn out to be scared boys singing Christmas carols. They cannot process the idea that humanity exists on both sides of a battlefield. The story of that Christmas Eve was dangerous because it complicated everything. It suggested that German soldiers were not monsters, they were men. It suggested that American soldiers were not perfect heroes following orders without emotion. They were human beings, capable of empathy even toward enemies. It opened the door to uncomfortable questions. If these men could share a song, what else could they have shared? If they could recognize each other's humanity for 8 minutes, Why did the killing continue for 5 more months? The story did not fit into the clean narrative of good versus evil, so it was easier to forget it, easier to let it fade, easier to pretend it never happened. But the men who were there never forgot. They carried it with them through their entire lives, a secret weight that shaped how they understood war, humanity, and themselves. Some became peace activists after the war, quietly working in their communities to prevent future conflicts, driven by the memory of that night. Others became more cynical, unable to reconcile the beauty of that moment with the horror of everything that came before and after it. A few tried to write about it, but publishers rejected their stories. Too sentimental, too unbelievable, too soft for a war that demanded hardness. The culture was not ready to hear that enemies had sung together. Maybe it never would be. The German survivors faced an even deeper silence. In post-war Germany, being a soldier was a source of shame, not pride. The country was confronting the unimaginable crimes of the Nazi regime, and anyone who had worn a German uniform was viewed with suspicion, even hatred. Many former soldiers lied about their service, claimed they had been conscripted against their will, or simply refused to speak about the war at all. The idea of sharing a story about singing with American guards seemed absurd, even insulting to the millions who had suffered. So they stayed quiet. They raised families, they rebuilt their lives, and they kept the memory of Stille Nacht locked away where nobody could judge them for it. What makes this silence even more tragic is that the story was not unique. Across the fronts of World War II, there were countless small moments of humanity. Moments when soldiers on opposite sides shared cigarettes, helped wounded enemies, or simply acknowledged each other as human beings before returning to the killing. But almost none of those stories were recorded, almost none were celebrated, because war does not reward compassion. War rewards victory. And stories of shared humanity do not help recruit the next generation of soldiers. They do not justify the next war. They complicate the narrative, and so they disappear, buried beneath the weight of official history. The power of that Christmas Eve lies not in what happened, but in what it reveals about the nature of war itself. War is not a natural state. Human beings are not born wanting to kill each other. War is constructed. It requires training, propaganda, dehumanization, and constant reinforcement of the idea that the enemy is fundamentally different, fundamentally evil, fundamentally other. Soldiers are taught to see uniforms, not faces. They are taught to hear orders, not songs. They are taught that mercy is weakness and empathy is betrayal, and this training works most of the time. It has to work, because without it, wars could not be fought. Without it, men would refuse to kill. But Silent Night cut through all of that in 8 minutes. It bypassed the training. It ignored the propaganda. It reached past the uniforms and the weapons and the orders, straight into the part of the human brain where childhood memories live, where mothers' voices sing lullabies, where Christmas means safety and home and love. The song was not a political statement. It was not a protest. It was simply a reminder that every man in that camp, American and German alike, had once been a child who believed in goodness, and for 8 minutes that memory was stronger than the machinery of war. This is why the story terrifies military institutions, not because it shows weakness, but because it shows the fragility of the entire system. If music can stop a war even for 8 minutes, what else can stop it? If enemy soldiers can recognize each other's humanity through a shared song, what happens to the justifications for future wars? The story of that Christmas Eve does not fit into the narrative that war is inevitable, that enemies are fundamentally different, that violence is the only language nations understand. It suggests something far more dangerous, that peace is always possible, that humanity is always present, and that the choice to kill is exactly that, a choice. The reason this story remained hidden for 60 years was not conspiracy. It was not a cover-up ordered by generals or politicians. It was something more insidious and more human. It was collective amnesia, a society choosing to forget what does not fit its understanding of itself. The veterans stayed silent because they did not think anyone would care. The historians ignored it because it seemed trivial compared to the Battle of the Bulge or D-Day. The public dismissed it because it did not match the movies and documentaries that taught them what World War II was supposed to look like. And so the story faded, not because anyone actively suppressed it, but because nobody actively remembered it. But here is the truth that makes this story matter today. Those men in that camp, guards and prisoners alike, were not special. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. They did not plan to create a moment of peace. They did not set out to prove a point about humanity. They simply heard a song and they could not help but sing. And if ordinary men in the middle of the most brutal war in human history could find their way to that moment, then maybe, just maybe, we are all capable of more compassion than we think. Maybe the walls we build between us and them, between ally and enemy, between us and the world, are thinner than we want to admit. Maybe they can be broken with nothing more than a melody. The story gained new life in the early 2000s, not through official channels but through the internet. Veterans' families began sharing their fathers' and grandfathers' stories on forums and blogs. Historians who had dismissed the account as folklore started finding too much corroborating evidence to ignore. The story appeared in small local newspapers, then in academic journals, and finally in a documentary that aired on public television in 2008. But even then, it remained largely unknown. It did not make it into high school textbooks. It was not taught alongside the major battles. It remained a footnote, a curiosity, a story that people found touching but ultimately irrelevant to the grand sweep of history. But relevance is not measured only in strategic importance. Sometimes the smallest moments reveal the deepest truths. That Christmas Eve did not change the outcome of World War II. The war continued for 5 more months. Hundreds of thousands more died. Cities burned. Concentration camps were liberated. Germany surrendered. Japan fell. The world rebuilt itself from ruins. And through all of that, the 8 minutes of singing in a frozen prison camp changed nothing about the geopolitical reality. But it changed everything for the men who were there. It gave them a memory that war could not destroy, a proof that even in hell, beauty could exist for a moment. One of the American veterans interviewed in 2006 said something that captures the essence of why this story matters. He said that after the war, he struggled for years with nightmares and guilt, with the weight of things he had seen and things he had done. He had killed men. He had watched friends die. He had survived when so many others had not. And for decades, he could not reconcile the violence with his belief that he was a good person. But then, late in his life, he remembered that Christmas Eve. He remembered singing with the enemy. And he realized that the moment proved something crucial. It proved that even when the world demands you become a killer, even when survival requires hardness, the part of you that is capable of kindness does not die. It just waits. And sometimes, when the world is quiet enough, it emerges. The German veteran in Bavaria, the one who sang Stille Nacht in the nursing home, told a similar story. He said that for most of his life, he carried shame for having been a German soldier, for having been part of a nation that committed unspeakable atrocities. He had not been in the SS. He had not participated in war crimes, but he wore the uniform, and that was enough to carry a lifetime of guilt. He avoided talking about the war. He avoided veteran gatherings. He tried to erase that part of his life. But the memory of that Christmas Eve stayed with him, and in his final years he realized it was the only memory from the war that did not hurt. It was the only moment where he felt like a human being rather than a cog in a machine of death. These testimonies reveal something profound about memory and trauma. War veterans often speak about the difficulty of returning to normal life, of explaining to people who were not there what it was like, of carrying experiences that cannot be translated into words. But the memory of that Christmas Eve was different. It was not about explaining horror. It was not about justifying violence. It was about holding on to a single moment of grace in the midst of chaos. And that moment, small as it was, became a lifeline for men who spent decades trying to make sense of what they had lived through. In 2014, 70 years after that Christmas Eve, something remarkable happened. A German historian managed to identify the exact location of the camp where the singing had occurred. It was near a small town in what is now central Germany, a place that had been rebuilt after the war and showed no trace of the barbed wire and guard towers that once stood there. The town council, upon learning the story, decided to erect a small memorial. It was not a grand monument, just a simple stone marker with a plaque that told the story in both English and German, with the opening lines of Silent Night engraved beneath. The dedication ceremony was attended by 3 people, the last 3 living witnesses to that night: 2 Americans, both in their 90s, and 1 German, who had made the journey from Bavaria despite his frail health. The ceremony was small and quiet. Local townspeople attended, curious about this piece of history they had never known. A church choir sang Silent Night in both languages, just as it had been sung 70 years earlier. The 3 old men stood together, leaning on canes, tears streaming down their faces. They had not seen each other since 1944. They had been on opposite sides of a war. One of the Americans had guarded the German had been his prisoner. And now, 7 decades later, they embraced, not as former enemies finding reconciliation, but as old men who shared a memory that nobody else on earth could fully understand. They stood there holding each other up while the choir sang, and for those few minutes the world once again stopped around them. The memorial still stands today, though few people visit it. It is off the main roads, away from the major World War II tourist sites that draw millions of visitors each year. You will not find it on most maps. Tour guides do not include it in their itineraries. It remains what it has always been, a quiet acknowledgement of a moment that the world forgot. But for those who do find it, who read the plaque and understand what happened there, it becomes something more than a historical marker. It becomes a question. If these men could find their humanity in the middle of total war, what excuse do we have for the hatred we carry in peacetime? The story has gained some traction in recent years, appearing in articles around Christmas time, shared on social media as a heartwarming tale of holiday spirit. But most of these retellings miss the point. They frame it as a feel-good story, a moment of magic during wartime, a reminder that Christmas brings out the best in people. And while that is true, it is also too simple. The story is not heartwarming, it is heartbreaking. Because the singing stopped, the war continued, men went back to killing each other. The machine did not pause for long. And that is the real tragedy. Not that the moment happened, but that it was so rare, so fragile, so easily forgotten. What the story really tells us is that we have always known how to stop wars. We have always had the capacity for empathy, for seeing the humanity in our enemies, for choosing peace over violence. We do not lack the ability, we lack the will. We lack the courage to act on what we know to be true, that the person on the other side of the wire, the other side of the border, the other side of the political divide, is fundamentally the same as us. They have families, they have fears, they sing the same songs, and we could, if we chose to, put down our weapons and sing with them. But we do not. Not because we cannot, but because we have convinced ourselves that we must not, that security requires separation, that strength requires hatred, that survival requires treating others as less than human. The 3 old men who stood at that memorial in 2014 are all dead now. The last living witnesses to that Christmas Eve are gone. The story now exists only in records, in interviews preserved on video, in the memories of people who heard it second-hand. And soon, even those will fade. The memorial will erode, the plaque will become unreadable. And the moment when American guards and German prisoners sang Silent Night together will become once again just another forgotten piece of history. Unless we choose to remember it. Unless we choose to ask ourselves why stories like this are always buried. And unless we choose to believe that 8 minutes of shared humanity matter more than we have been taught to think. So why was this story erased from history? The answer is uncomfortable but simple, because it reveals that war is a choice, not a destiny. Because it shows that even in the most justified war in modern history, the war against fascism, the war we call the Good War, there were moments when men on both sides recognized that they had more in common with each other than with the leaders who sent them to fight. And that recognition is dangerous. It threatens the entire structure of how nations justify violence. It suggests that soldiers are not warriors or heroes or instruments of policy. They are human beings, forced into impossible situations, capable of both terrible violence and extraordinary compassion. The institutions that shape our understanding of history, military academies, government archives, film studios, textbook publishers, have no incentive to highlight stories like this. Not because they are malicious, but because their job is to maintain narratives that serve national purposes. They need to train the next generation of soldiers. They need to justify defense budgets. They need to maintain the idea that war, while tragic, is sometimes necessary, and that when it is necessary, it must be fought with discipline and emotional distance. A story about guards singing with prisoners undermines all of that. It suggests that emotional distance is a lie, that discipline can be broken by a melody, and that the humanity we are told to suppress in war is actually the strongest force we possess. This is not a story with a happy ending. The singing did not stop the war. It did not save lives. It did not prevent future conflicts. The men who shared that moment went back to their roles as captors and captives, and many of them carried trauma for the rest of their lives. The world did not become more peaceful because of 8 minutes of music in a frozen prison camp. But the story endures even in its obscurity because it proves something we desperately need to remember. It proves that the walls we build between ourselves and others are thinner than we think. It proves that propaganda and training and dehumanization, as powerful as they are, cannot completely erase our capacity for empathy. And it proves that sometimes, when we least expect it, beauty breaks through. The legacy of that Christmas Eve is not in monuments or textbooks. It is in the handful of people who know the story and carry it forward. It is in the families of those veterans who heard the tale and understood that their fathers and grandfathers were more complex than the war hero narrative allowed. It is in the historians who refused to dismiss it as sentimentality and insisted on documenting the evidence. And it is in moments like this, when someone chooses to tell the story again, to pull it out of obscurity and ask why it was hidden in the first place. Every time this story is told, it becomes an act of resistance against the simplification of history, against the idea that wars are only about strategies and battles and winners and losers. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. The next time you are told that a group of people is fundamentally different from you, fundamentally dangerous, fundamentally other, remember that on Christmas Eve 1944, American soldiers and German prisoners sang the same song in different languages and cried the same tears. Remember that the men who were supposed to hate each other found their way to a shared moment of humanity, without permission, without orders, without any guarantee that it would not cost them dearly. And remember that if they could do that in the middle of the deadliest war in human history, then maybe, just maybe, the divisions we accept as inevitable today are nothing more than choices we have not yet found the courage to unmake. The story of that Christmas Eve was buried for 70 years, not because it was insignificant, but because it was too significant, because it asked questions nobody wanted to answer, because it suggested that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of the will to recognize our shared humanity, even when everything else tells us to look away. That is why it matters. That is why it should never be forgotten again. And that is why every Christmas somewhere in the world, someone should sing Silent Night and remember the night when enemies became human, if only for 8 minutes, if only for the length of a song.